call on Deputy Shortall. Deputy Shortall, you have 15 minutes.
Cathaoirleach, in my view, the game is up for water charges. The bottom line is that the public have simply not accepted them. And if the government doesn't accept that fact at this stage, you're even more out of touch than I thought you were. And the public have not accepted water charges for a number of different reasons. Some because they object in principle to water charges. Some because they simply cannot afford them. Some because they're sick and tired of cronyism. Some because of the shocking level of government incompetence. But most, I believe, because they are sick and tired of having to pay charge after charge, while others, most notably the bondholders, have got away scot-free. This, for many people, is a charge too far. And I have to say that no amount of mea culpa from ministers and government backbenchers is going to change that fact. And the point is that without public acceptance of these charges, all other plans that the government may have for investment in water infrastructure are actually redundant. It's time, I believe, that the government realise this. It is simply going to have to find another way. The first test that the government has failed is in relation to fairness. These charges, by any yardstick, are regressive charges. They take no account whatsoever of a person's ability to pay. They're all the same. They apply to everybody equally. And, Minister, as you well know, that's a regressive charge. This is really the introduction of what is essentially a flat charge. And there's been an attempt to soften the blow of those charges, to try and, get political acceptance of the charges by introducing what is termed a conservation grant. Now, that's a complete and utter misnomer. This has nothing whatsoever to do with conservation. In fact, the earlier defence of charges, which was that they were about conservation, has now gone out the window. People who have invested in water butts, for example, all the different schemes that have been operated in schools to try and encourage conservation, all of the habits that people are trying to change in terms of using water more sparingly, that's all gone out the window now. It doesn't count at all because, this is a flat charge, so conservation doesn't matter. It's a capped charge. And as I say, it's a flat charge. It benefits rich and poor equally. Of course, there is no detail of when people are actually going to get this conservation grant. We're told that people may start to apply from next September 2015. So does anybody know when people will actually receive it? And certainly in the case of low-income families, they're going to have to fork out the full amount for most of next year without getting any grant. This is clearly back of an envelope stuff where none of the detail has been worked out in relation to this so-called grant. So it'll certainly be the end of next year by the time people with low incomes and everybody else will get any kind of relief in respect of the charges. So we don't know anything about when and how this is going to be paid. We will also be facing into the spectacle, I believe, of the Department of Social Protection sending out cheques for €100 to every household in the country, regardless of their circumstances. And it's ironic really that this is a proposal that's being put forward by the government, that the Department of Social Protection, of all departments, would be engaged in this exercise of sending every household €100, while at the same time they claim they can't reverse the cuts that have taken place to so many different welfare payments that have happened over recent years. The government said that part of the reason for introducing setting up Irish Water is that they won't be competing for scarce resources with services like education and health and other important public services. But of course they will, because at some point at the end of next year, we could have that situation where the Department of Social Welfare will be sending out rebates up to a potential level of €130 million to every household, for every household in the country to receive this so-called grant. So in the budget at the end of next year, of course those figures come into play in that. Of course they will be competing. The need to send out that cheque for €100 to every household, irrespective of circumstances, that need will be competing with the needs of schools and hospitals and public transport and all of the other essential services that are so underfunded at the moment. Fine Gael must really be delighted that thousands of its rural voters with private supplies will get a €100 grant that they certainly weren't expecting. And, you know, the other point about this issue of fairness is that the Minister yesterday, the Taoiseach last night, and indeed the Taoiseach on several occasions have claimed that everyone will be better off next year than they are this year. This is simply not true, and I would ask government ministers to stop misleading people by making those statements. People with incomes of less than €10,000 will not be better off next year. The prioritisation of tax cuts for the better off, a reduction in the top rate of tax, will ensure that people on very low incomes, less than 10,000, get nothing whatsoever out of the budget. People on short-term welfare payments will certainly not be better off next year. So we know then that all people on low incomes, whether that's from low-paid work, the working poor, or indeed people on short-term welfare payments, when they have to pay their water charges, they will be worse off next year. And that figure, you know, is certainly into the hundreds of thousands next year. So stop misleading people. I'd say that to ministers. Of course, the other point that arises in this regard is the impact of all of this on the Department of Social Protection, not simply in respect of its budget, which I've referred to already, but in terms of the cost of administering the scheme, whereby they'll have to give a rebate or a grant, let's call it, to every household. Has the cost of the administration of that actually been factored into all of this? I doubt it very much. Will the department, as a matter of interest, have to set up a new section? Because I'm not aware of any other payment coming from the Department of Social Protection that has to be made to every single household. So how many staff are going to be diverted into this exercise of sending €100 to everybody? Will extra staff be recruited, or will they be taken from other sections of the department where we know there is understaffing at the moment? We know there are long waiting lists for a number of the payments. I think for carers allowance it's 3 months. Are those waiting lists going to increase now as a result of this? In relation to Irish Water itself then, I want to make a number of points. While the level of these new charges may seem reasonable, everybody knows, of course, that they are the thin end of the wedge. And that's the huge problem and concern that people have about these. They are undoubtedly the thin end of the wedge, and the direction of the charges can only go in one way, and that's up. There has also been suggestions today that the actual user data that the government is quoting is not accurate, and it's certainly not in line with user data coming from the UK and indeed other European countries. So, you know, the claim is that the government is significantly understating the level of usage of water. and those chickens are going to come home to roost. The government has sought to justify the setting up of Irish Water by saying this is a special purpose vehicle, as it were, which will allow Irish Water to borrow and to sell bonds and so on. Now, that's being portrayed as if this is something that happens in isolation from everything else and in isolation from the users of, or the customers of Irish Water. Now, we know at this stage that bonds have to be repaid, loans have to be repaid. The public have learned that the hard way. So to suggest that this in some way is going to get somebody else to pay for the water is again completely misleading. Because people realise that whatever loans are taken out, and significant loans will need to be taken out, significant bonds will need to be purchased, they will have to be repaid. And the people who will repay that are the public. The public will have to repay those loans through higher charges in the future. Whatever about controlling them in the short term, it's inevitable that they will rise exponentially in order to repay those loans. There's no question about that, and people shouldn't be misled in relation to that. There's also, huge questions about the viability of Irish Water after yesterday's announcement. How can any investor, for example, have confidence that in relation to the uncertainty of the user fees, why would anyone invest in Irish Water when the management have shown such vast incompetence and lack of leadership? How would anybody invest and have confidence in investing in Irish Water when the funding and business model keeps changing? We're told that there will be penalties for non-payment, but given that those penalties have been pushed out to, at least the middle of 2016, what happens if people hang on and don't bother paying until penalties kick in? Well, then there's no revenue coming into Irish Water. And it seems that suddenly the CEO has no role whatsoever in any of this, even though the Taoiseach has repeatedly said that their role is vital. If it's the case that 50% of people can get a rebate, well, then that significantly reduces the potential income of Irish Water. And what are the implications of that for the funding model? And of course, the other thing is in relation to the collection of data and the question of passing the market corporation test. The figures are so shaky. There's no confidence in these figures being robust at all. What happens then? What happens if it fails the test? And of course, we had all the promises of legislation. They mean nothing really at all. To suggest that you can legislate for a plebiscite, there's no provision for a plebiscite in this country. To suggest that you can legislate so that a referendum is required is absolute nonsense. Legislation can be overturned by any future government, so there's no way of tying that down in relation to a promised referendum. Equally, there's no way of tying the hand of a future government through legislation by promising that charges will always be capped. So, there are major problems with this, Minister. The public simply does not accept what the government is doing. And that's because of your track record in this regard. You didn't stand up for the country against the interests of the bondholders and the ECB. You didn't show fairness when it came to imposing the burden of austerity. Income and spending cuts were imposed disproportionately on the poor, and now tax cuts favour the better off. You didn't show any appetite for the political reform that you promised. The bonus culture of Irish Water, the stuffing of the board, and the political payoff of Phil Hogan have proven that. Apart from fairness and reform, of course, people expected a level of competence. They have been very disappointed in this. This whole debacle has shown that the government is not capable of setting up a new body. It is not capable of bringing in a new regime in a manner that can secure the confidence of the public. It is a shambles. It is an unmitigated disaster. The government has seriously failed the tests of fairness, reform and competence. And that, Minister, is the reason why this government has lost the confidence of the people. Thank you.
Deputy Shortall.